My beloved child, do not move past this moment too quickly. There is something hidden beneath the silence that you have been feeling, something that has been building where your eyes could not see it. Stay till the end, because what begins as a voice message becomes something much deeper than a few trembling words. Something huge is waiting for you, and the most important part is not the crying itself. It is what your soulmate finally admits after believing they had already lost the courage to say it. For so long, you may have wondered why everything became so quiet. Why someone who seemed capable of saying so much suddenly said almost nothing. Why there were moments when you could almost feel words approaching, only for silence to return. You may have imagined conversations that never happened. You may have wondered whether the connection mattered to them as deeply as it mattered to you. But tonight, in this story, you are being taken behind that silence. You are being shown the moment when everything they had been holding inside became too heavy to carry. Do not skip, because the first thing you need to understand is that the voice message was never supposed to be sent. They recorded it once. Then deleted it. They recorded it again. They stopped halfway through. They placed the phone down and walked away because their hands were trembling too much to continue. And then something happened. Something small from the outside, but enormous inside their heart. They saw something that reminded them of you. Not necessarily a photograph. Not necessarily your name appearing somewhere. It could have been a song, a familiar phrase, a place, a memory, or simply the strange way certain moments return when someone has spent too long pretending they no longer care. Whatever it was, it opened the door they had been trying desperately to keep closed. And suddenly, they could not hide behind silence anymore. They picked up the phone again. This time, they did not rehearse. They did not prepare. They did not search for perfect words. They simply pressed record. At first there was silence. Several seconds of it. The kind of silence that says more than an entire conversation because you can hear someone trying to decide whether they are brave enough to tell the truth. Then came a breath. Then another. And finally, your soulmate whispered something they had been afraid to say. I don't know if you'll ever hear this. Those were the words that opened the floodgate. Because immediately after saying them, everything changed. Their carefully controlled voice began to break. Their confidence disappeared. The walls they had built around their emotions began falling one after another. And the person who had tried so hard to appear unaffected suddenly sounded nothing like the person everyone else knew. Do not skip. The next part matters. They were not crying because they wanted sympathy. They were not crying because they wanted to manipulate you into returning. They were crying because they had finally reached the point where pretending became more painful than admitting the truth. And the truth had your name written all over it. There are emotions people can hide for days. There are feelings they can hide for months. Sometimes people become so skilled at appearing fine that even those closest to them believe the performance. They laugh. They work. They answer questions. They continue with ordinary life. They say, everything is okay. But then night comes. The noise disappears. There is nobody left to impress. And whatever was buried begins speaking. That is where this voice message was born. Not in drama. Not in anger. Not in some carefully planned confession. It was born in the quiet moment when your soulmate realized that every excuse they had used to avoid their feelings had finally stopped working. They could no longer tell themselves they had forgotten you. They could no longer pretend the distance had solved everything. They could no longer convince themselves that time had erased what existed between you. And then came the sentence they had avoided more than any other. I thought I had more time. Stay till the end, because those words are connected to something much bigger. Your soulmate had spent so long assuming there would always be another opportunity. Another day to speak. Another chance to explain. Another moment when circumstances would become easier. They believed they could postpone honesty until they felt completely ready. But hearts do not always wait for perfect timing. Life continues moving. People grow. Doors change. And suddenly your soulmate began realizing that while they were waiting to become brave enough, you might have been learning how to live without the answers they never gave you. That realization shook them. Because there was something they had misunderstood about you. They believed your patience meant you would always remain exactly where they left you. They mistook your understanding for endless availability. They mistook your quietness for weakness. They thought that because you cared deeply, you would continue waiting indefinitely for them to figure themselves out. But something changed. Perhaps they noticed that your energy was no longer reaching toward them in the same way. Perhaps they sensed that you had stopped chasing explanations. Perhaps they realized that the version of you who once needed their answers had begun becoming someone who could create peace without them. And that was when fear entered their heart. Not fear of punishment. Not fear of anything dangerous. The simple human fear of realizing too late that someone precious may finally have learned their own worth. Something huge is waiting for you, because the voice message becomes even more revealing after this. There is another pause. A long one. You can almost imagine them staring at the screen, wondering whether to stop recording. But they continue. I need you to know something about why I disappeared. And there it is. The sentence you were never supposed to hear. For a long time, you may have interpreted distance as indifference. You may have thought their silence meant they did not care enough. You may have believed they stepped backward because the connection meant less to them than it meant to you. But the fictional revelation unfolding here turns that assumption upside down. They stepped backward because the connection required them to become honest with themselves. And honesty frightened them. You reflected things they had spent years avoiding. When you cared for them, they had to confront how unfamiliar genuine care felt. When you believed in them, they had to face all the ways they secretly doubted themselves. When you offered emotional honesty, they had to recognize how often they protected themselves through distance. You did not simply enter their life. You became a mirror. And mirrors can be uncomfortable when someone has spent years avoiding their own reflection. Do not skip, because this is where their tears become heavier. Their voice lowers. They confess that there were nights when they opened your conversation and stared at it without typing anything. There were moments when they nearly reached out. They wrote words. Deleted them. Wrote different words. Deleted those too. Sometimes they convinced themselves that silence was the mature choice. Sometimes they told themselves they needed more time. Sometimes pride interfered. Sometimes uncertainty interfered. Sometimes they simply did not know how to explain feelings they had never learned to name. But beneath every excuse lived the same truth. They missed you. Not only your presence. They missed the way they felt when they could be themselves around you. They missed being understood without having to explain every detail. They missed the strange comfort of knowing someone could notice the things they tried to hide. They missed your energy in ordinary moments. And perhaps most painfully, they missed the version of themselves that appeared when they felt safe with you. Then the voice message changes. The crying becomes quieter. And your soulmate says something almost impossible for them to admit. I kept waiting for you to come back first. There is the pride. There is the hidden expectation. There is the misunderstanding that created so much unnecessary distance. They believed you would eventually break the silence. They imagined you would reach out. They thought your love would overpower your disappointment. But what they did not understand was that you were changing too. You were learning something sacred about love. Caring about someone does not mean abandoning yourself. You were discovering that longing does not require chasing. You were beginning to understand that genuine connection cannot survive if only one person carries its emotional weight. And while they waited for the old version of you to return, that version of you was quietly disappearing. Not because your heart became cold. Because your heart became wiser. That is what your soulmate finally noticed. And it broke something open inside them. Stay till the end. There is another revelation coming. The voice message was not created merely because they missed you. Something happened before they recorded it. Someone asked them a question. A simple question. The kind that sounds harmless until it reaches exactly the place someone has been protecting. What happened between you two? Your soulmate tried to answer casually. They said something vague. They tried to make it sound complicated. They tried to explain the distance without revealing their emotions. But then the person listening asked another question. Did you ever actually tell them how you felt? Silence. Your soulmate had no answer. Because suddenly they realized something devastatingly simple. They had spent months expecting you to understand feelings they had never clearly expressed. They expected you to interpret silence. They expected you to decode hesitation. They expected you to somehow know what was hidden beneath mixed signals. They wanted you to understand the truth without ever giving you the truth. And in that moment, they saw the situation differently. They imagined everything from your side. Imagine caring about someone who keeps stepping backward. Imagine sensing affection but receiving uncertainty. Imagine wondering whether beautiful moments were real while being given no reassurance. Imagine trying to understand someone who refuses to explain themselves. For the first time, your soulmate stopped viewing the story through their own fear. They saw your confusion, your disappointment, your patience, your effort. Your silence. And then they understood why you changed. That understanding followed them home. It followed them into the quiet. It sat beside them when they picked up their phone. And that is why the voice message began with tears. Something huge is waiting for you. Because they still had not reached the confession that frightened them most. Their voice trembled again. I blamed timing because I was scared to blame myself. Those words surprised even them. You can hear it in the silence afterward. For so long they had blamed circumstances. Wrong timing. Too much happening. Too many responsibilities. Too much confusion. Not enough certainty. Maybe some of those things were real. But beneath them was another truth. They were scared. Scared of needing someone. Scared of being fully known. Scared that if they gave their whole heart, they could lose something they would never know how to replace. And because they feared losing you, they created the very distance that could cause exactly that. There is the paradox. There is the revelation. Sometimes people run from what matters because its importance terrifies them. Sometimes the heart recognizes something before the mind knows how to handle it. Sometimes someone can feel deeply and still behave confusingly because feeling and emotional courage are not the same thing. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that now. But understanding arrives with a difficult question. Is it too late? Do not skip. Because the message becomes almost painfully honest here. They say your name, or perhaps they cannot bring themselves to say it. Their breath catches. And they whisper. I don't know what you think of me anymore. That sentence carries everything. They wonder whether you remember the beautiful moments or only the silence afterward. They wonder whether you think they never cared. They wonder whether you have already closed the door emotionally. They wonder whether someone else will eventually receive the version of you they were too afraid to cherish properly. And that final thought is the one that makes their voice break again. Not jealousy. Not possession. Regret. The realization that love cannot be stored away and expected to remain unchanged forever. They can feel it. Something in you is different. You are not waiting with the same desperation. You are not searching every silence for hidden meaning. You are not trying as hard to make sense of contradictions. And strangely, your healing has become the thing that finally forced them to confront themselves. Because when you stopped running after answers, they had nowhere left to hide from the questions. Why did I stay silent? Why did I make this harder? Why did I assume they would always understand? Why did I protect my pride more carefully than I protected the connection? Why did I wait? Those questions filled the room. Then came another line. One that changed the entire meaning of the voice message. I almost contacted you yesterday. Almost. That word carries a whole unseen story. They had your conversation open. Their finger hovered over the screen. They knew what they wanted to say. But something stopped them. Not because they changed their mind about you. Because suddenly they wondered whether reaching out now would be selfish. What if you were finally healing? What if hearing from them reopened something you had worked hard to close? What if they entered your life again only to become afraid and disappear again? And for perhaps the first time, your soulmate realized that wanting you back was not enough. They needed to become someone capable of staying. Do not skip. That is the turning point. Until this moment, the voice message has been about emotion. Now it becomes about responsibility. They begin admitting where they failed. Not dramatically. Not by calling themselves terrible. But honestly. I should have communicated. I should have trusted what I felt. I should not have expected you to read my silence. I should have told you when I was overwhelmed instead of disappearing. I should have understood that you needed clarity too. Each sentence removes another layer of pride. And then there is silence again. But this silence feels different. Earlier, silence represented fear. Now it feels like someone standing at the edge of truth. They take another breath. And say, there is one thing you still don't know. Something huge is waiting for you. This is the moment the entire message has been moving toward. But before they reveal it, they begin telling a story. A memory involving you. Not necessarily the grandest memory. Not some cinematic celebration. Something ordinary. Maybe you once asked if they were okay when everyone else assumed they were fine. Maybe you remembered a tiny detail they had forgotten telling you. Maybe you encouraged them when they secretly felt like giving up on something important. Maybe you sat with them emotionally without trying to fix everything. To you, perhaps it seemed small. To them, it was not. Because they had spent much of their life believing they needed to earn affection by being useful, impressive, strong, entertaining, successful, or emotionally controlled. Then you appeared. And somehow, in one ordinary moment, you made them feel that simply being themselves could be enough. They never forgot it. They tried. But they never did. That memory became the standard against which other connections were quietly measured. And something always felt missing. Not because nobody else had value. But because what happened between you had its own language. A language built from little things. A look understood without explanation. A conversation remembered months later. A feeling of familiarity that neither of you could completely explain. Your soulmate admits that they tried to convince themselves this could be recreated easily. It could not. They met people. They stayed busy. They distracted themselves. They filled calendars. They found reasons not to think. But certain quiet moments always returned them to the same emotional doorway. You. Stay till the end, because the next confession is the one they nearly removed from the recording. I compared everyone to how safe I felt with you. Immediately afterward, they say. That isn't fair. I know. And they are right. Other people should not have to compete with a memory. But the confession reveals something important. They had not actually processed what happened between you. They had only moved around it. They had continued living without truly resolving the emotional story. And unresolved stories have a way of appearing in unexpected places. A familiar song. A certain hour of night. A conversation about love. Someone asking what kind of person they really want beside them. A dream. A memory. A photograph. A sentence. And suddenly the heart remembers what the mind tried to archive. That is what happened tonight. The past did not return because your soulmate wanted drama. It returned because they had finally become quiet enough to hear themselves. And what they heard surprised them. They were not over the truth. They were over pretending. Do not skip. Now the message reaches the part they are most afraid you will misunderstand. They say, "I'm not sending this to ask you to rescue me." Their voice is steadier now. "I'm sending it because you deserved honesty from me a long time ago." That sentence changes everything. Because suddenly the voice message is no longer merely an emotional breakdown. It becomes accountability. Your soulmate begins understanding that love cannot simply be a feeling kept privately inside the heart. Love must become honesty, consistency, respect, courage, presence. Otherwise the other person experiences only confusion. They realize now that whatever they felt internally did not automatically erase the pain created externally. Their intentions cannot rewrite your experience. Their fear cannot become an excuse forever. And their tears cannot demand your forgiveness. This understanding is painful. But it is also growth. Because the person recording this message is not asking you to erase what happened. They are finally acknowledging it. And perhaps that is why the words sound different from anything they would have said before. There is less performance. Less defensiveness. Less explanation. More truth. Then they say something you were not expecting. "If you never choose me again, I still needed you to know that you mattered." Their voice breaks. Not because they are surrendering. Because they are finally separating love from control. They cannot decide what you do next. They cannot decide whether you answer. They cannot decide whether you trust them. They cannot decide whether your heart still has room. All they can control is whether they finally become truthful. And that truth has been waiting a long time. Something huge is waiting for you, because there is still one hidden detail. Why tonight? Why this exact moment? Why after all this silence would everything suddenly become impossible to contain? There was another reason. Something your soulmate discovered about themselves. Earlier that day, they had been imagining their future. Not deliberately thinking about you. Just thinking about life. Where they wanted to be. What kind of home they wanted. What kind of peace they wanted. What kind of person they hoped to become. And then, without warning, one image entered their mind. You were there. Not as some dramatic fantasy. You were simply part of the ordinary picture. Sitting nearby. Laughing. Talking. Existing in the peaceful future they had imagined. And the realization struck them so deeply that they had to stop what they were doing. Because they understood something. When they imagined excitement, many possibilities appeared. When they imagined attention, many possibilities appeared. When they imagined temporary happiness, many possibilities appeared. But when they imagined peace, their heart remembered you. That was what broke them. Not obsession. Recognition. The quiet recognition that what they had been searching for outside themselves was connected to something they had once been too frightened to appreciate fully. And suddenly all those delayed conversations felt heavier. All those unsent messages felt louder. All those opportunities they assumed would return began looking precious. That is why they reached for the phone. That is why the recording happened. That is why their voice broke before they had even said everything. Stay till the end. Your soulmate continues. I don't miss only what we had. I miss what we could have become if I had been brave. There it is. The grief is not merely about the past. It is about the unwritten future. The conversations that could have happened. The places you could have gone. The ordinary mornings. The difficult days you could have faced together. The celebrations. The inside jokes that never had time to exist. The version of both of you that might have emerged if fear had not interrupted the story. And this is where your soulmate realizes that regret is not always wishing to return to yesterday. Sometimes regret is seeing tomorrow clearly and realizing yesterday's fear may have changed its direction. But listen carefully. This message is not telling you to abandon your boundaries. It is not telling you to chase. It is not telling you that tears automatically prove someone has changed. Emotion can open a door. Only actions can show what happens afterward. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate knows this too. That is why they say, I know words aren't enough anymore. Those words may be the most mature thing in the entire recording. Because once, your soulmate believed the perfect explanation could solve everything. Now they understand. There is no magical sentence. No dramatic confession. No emotional voice note powerful enough to replace consistency. If they want another opportunity, they must show up differently. If they want trust, they must help rebuild it. If they want closeness, they must stop disappearing whenever closeness becomes uncomfortable. If they want your heart, they must respect the heart they are asking to enter. And this realization leads to the most surprising shift yet. Their crying begins to stop. Their breathing slows. Their voice becomes clear. Almost as if speaking the truth has finally removed something heavy from their chest. They say, if there is still a door, I want to knock properly this time. Not force it. Not assume it will open. Knock. Wait. Respect your answer. That difference matters. Do not skip, because the final minutes of this voice message contain something that changes the entire emotional direction. Your soulmate admits they had imagined contacting you with some casual excuse. A simple, "How are you?" A random question. A harmless message pretending nothing serious existed underneath. They almost did it. But they stopped themselves. Because they realized casual words would be another hiding place. If they contacted you, they wanted to be honest. No games. No pretending. No mysterious hints. No expecting you to decode their intentions. And that decision frightened them. Because honesty means risk. Once the truth is spoken, they cannot hide behind uncertainty anymore. You could accept it. You could reject it. You could need time. You could say nothing. And they would have to respect whatever came next. For someone who spent so long controlling emotional risk through silence, that feels enormous. Yet they continue recording. That is the transformation happening inside this fictional moment. They are learning that courage is not knowing the outcome. Courage is telling the truth without being able to control what happens afterward. Something huge is waiting for you. Because they finally return to that sentence. There is one thing you still don't know. Their voice becomes almost a whisper. And suddenly everything slows. They tell you that during the time apart, there was one particular moment when they came closer to reaching out than you ever realized. A night when they had already typed everything. Not 2 sentences. Not a casual greeting. Everything. The truth about why they withdrew. The truth about what they felt. The truth about what frightened them. The truth about how often they thought about you. The truth about the future they secretly imagined. The message was ready. Their finger was over the send button. And then they received something. Not from you. From someone else. A message. A conversation. A piece of information. Something that made them believe reaching out to you would be a mistake. So they deleted everything. And you never knew. Perhaps you spent that same period wondering why they remained silent. Perhaps you assumed they had forgotten. Perhaps you believed the story had ended naturally. But behind the scenes, one piece of information had changed their decision. Do not skip. Because now your soulmate reveals that they recently discovered that information was incomplete. They had made an emotional decision based on something they did not fully understand. And when the fuller truth became clear, they felt the floor disappear beneath everything they had believed. Suddenly they began replaying the timeline. The message they deleted. The opportunity they abandoned. The assumptions they made. The things they never asked you directly. And one question began haunting them. What if I walked away from something real because I believed something I never verified? That question is what finally shattered their composure. The tears were not only because they missed you. They were grieving the possibility that silence had been built on misunderstanding. That is why the voice message sounds different. That is why there is urgency without pressure. That is why they keep stopping to breathe. They are not merely confessing love. They are dismantling the story they had told themselves. Stay till the end. They say. I should have asked you. 4 words. Simple. Powerful. I should have asked you. Instead of assuming. Instead of listening to fear. Instead of allowing uncertainty to become fact. Instead of constructing an entire conclusion without giving you the opportunity to speak. They should have asked you. And now they understand how much might have changed if they had. But there is something even bigger. Because the misunderstanding was not the only thing they recently discovered. There was another truth hidden underneath it. A truth about you. Something you had done quietly. Something they never knew. Something that completely changed how they viewed the past. Their voice shakes again when they approach it. They say they found out that during one of the hardest periods of their life, when they assumed you had stopped caring, you had actually been protecting their peace in a way they never saw. You had chosen not to add pressure. You had respected their space. You had held back words you could have used against them. You had cared without demanding recognition. And while they interpreted your silence as distance, part of your silence had actually been restraint. That discovery broke through their final defense. Because suddenly they saw the difference between your silence and theirs. Their silence had often been fear. Yours had sometimes been love with boundaries. They had thought you stopped caring. But you had simply stopped proving your care at the expense of yourself. And now they finally understood. Do not skip. The message is approaching its deepest revelation. Your soulmate says, I thought losing you would happen all at once. They pause. But it didn't. Their voice cracks again. It happened slowly. Slowly. Every unanswered conversation. Every avoided truth. Every moment they chose pride. Every time you needed clarity and received uncertainty. Every opportunity to step closer that became another step backward. The realization that people deserve clarity. The realization that someone who continually receives uncertainty may eventually choose peace. And your soulmate knows you have been moving toward peace. They had imagined loss as one dramatic goodbye. But now they understand that sometimes people lose closeness through hundreds of tiny absences. And that realization frightens them more than any single argument ever could. Because there is no one moment they can undo. There is only a pattern they must change. That is why this voice message matters. It is the first moment they stop asking, how do I get you back? And begin asking, how do I become someone who would not repeat what hurt us? That question changes everything. Something huge is waiting for you, because now their confession turns toward the future. They tell you they have been thinking about what they would do differently. They would speak when something bothered them. They would stop expecting you to guess. They would tell you when fear appeared instead of allowing fear to make decisions. They would listen without preparing a defense. They would choose consistency over dramatic promises. They would respect your boundaries. They would stop treating vulnerability as weakness. They would remember that love cannot grow where two people are constantly protecting themselves from each other. But then they stop. Because they realize something else. They cannot promise you a perfect future. Nobody can. So instead they say, I can only promise that I finally understand what I was doing. And strangely, that imperfect sentence feels more sincere than every perfect promise they could have made. Because transformation begins with awareness. Not performance. Not grand declarations. Awareness. The ability to recognize the pattern before repeating it. And your soulmate is finally seeing the pattern clearly. They were not afraid because you were wrong for them. They were afraid because the connection mattered enough to expose everything they had not healed within themselves. They confused emotional intensity with danger. They confused vulnerability with loss of control. They confused needing time with needing distance. And they confused your patience with permission to remain undecided forever. Now the illusion is gone. There is nowhere left to hide. The voice message continues. Their tone becomes softer. If you hear this, please don't feel responsible for my tears. That matters. Because they are taking ownership. These are mine. Another pause. I'm crying because I finally understand. And perhaps this is the most beautiful transformation in the entire story. Their tears are no longer asking you to save them. They are acknowledging what they have learned. They finally understand that your love was never supposed to repair every wound they refused to face. Your presence was never supposed to remove their responsibility to grow. You could support them, care for them, stand beside them. But you could not do their inner work for them. And maybe that is why the distance became necessary. Not as punishment. Not as some cruel twist. But because sometimes two people cannot meet each other differently until they first meet themselves honestly. Stay till the end. The final revelation is almost here. Your soulmate reaches the end of the recording. You can hear movement. Perhaps they stand near a window. Perhaps they are sitting somewhere completely still. Perhaps the room is dark except for the light of the phone. They have said more in these minutes than they allowed themselves to say for months. But one sentence remains. The sentence they have been circling since the beginning. They take a breath. I know why I'm really sending this tonight. Silence. And for several seconds, nothing happens. You might think the recording has ended. Then they continue. Because tomorrow I have to make a decision. There it is. The hidden reason behind the timing. The reason tonight feels different. The reason they could no longer postpone honesty. Tomorrow represents a threshold. Something in their life is changing. Perhaps an opportunity. Perhaps a move. Perhaps a commitment. Perhaps simply a personal decision that will determine whether they continue living from fear or finally choose courage. Whatever it is, they know they cannot step into the next chapter while carrying this unspoken truth. They need to decide whether they will continue protecting themselves from vulnerability or finally become honest about what their heart has been telling them. And somehow, that decision involves you. Not because your answer determines their worth. Not because they expect you to rescue them. But because there is one question they can no longer leave unanswered. Do they let this connection remain a story of almost? Almost spoke. Almost trusted. Almost reached out. Almost chose courage. Almost became something beautiful. Or do they finally risk discovering what truth could create? Do not skip. Their final words begin. I don't know what happens after you hear this. Their voice is quiet now. But I know I couldn't enter tomorrow pretending today didn't matter. Another breath. And you mattered. Pause. You still do. The recording could end there. It almost does. But then something happens. A sound. A notification. Your soulmate stops speaking. You hear them inhale sharply. Several seconds pass. Then they whisper. No. I didn't expect that. The entire energy of the voice message changes. Something has appeared on their phone while they are recording. Something they did not expect to see. And whatever it is seems connected to you. Their breathing changes. The tears stop. They read something silently. Once. Then again. And suddenly they say the words that make everything before this feel like only the beginning. So that's what really happened. Silence. A long, stunned silence. Then. I was wrong. Another pause. I was completely wrong. And now the voice message is no longer only a confession. It has become a revelation. Because whatever your soulmate has just discovered changes the meaning of the distance between you. It changes what they believed. It changes why they stayed silent. And most importantly, it changes the decision they were planning to make tomorrow. Something huge is waiting for you. Because your soulmate has finally discovered the missing piece. The one piece that was hidden from them. The one truth that could explain why two people who cared so deeply somehow ended up separated by assumptions, timing, fear, and silence. Their voice returns, but it no longer sounds broken. It sounds stunned. Focused. Almost breathless. I need to tell you what I just found out. They pause. And just before they reveal it, the recording cuts off.